Hi, and welcome everybody. This is the Portsmouth Public Library's Local History Talk featuring Charlie Jennison about the history of jazz on the Seacoast. My name is Polina Vasiliev, and I'm the Special Collections Assistant at the Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. I'm joined tonight by Nicole Luongo-Cloutier, Reference and Special Collections Supervisor. I have just a few notes from the library that I'll run through quickly. First, I'd like to go ahead and read our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or people of the dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. This program will last until 8:30, and we plan to be respectful of your time. If you have any questions about library services or upcoming programs, feel free to ask me at the end. Before I introduce Charlie, I just want to let you know about a couple of our upcoming library events that might be of interest to you if you're attending this local history program. Our next local history talk will be on Tuesday, February 23rd. It's an extra long event that will begin at 6:30 p.m. and run until 8:30. We will be hosting Barbara Steinbach and a small panel of guests to recount the storied history of the world-famous Elvis Room. This event does not require registration. You can find all the information, including the Zoom link, on our website and Facebook page. For tonight's local history talk, Charlie Jennison will be presenting about the local jazz scene from 1950 to 2000. He will be back in April to cover the scene from the 2000s to the present, and we're planning on holding that talk on April 13th, so mark your calendars now. We will also host an Indigenous Stories series, and the next event in that series will be on Monday, February 15th at 7 p.m. on Zoom. It's called Decolonial Organizing and Collaboration in New Hampshire, and we'll have members of the Indigenous Collaborative Collective of New Hampshire with us to discuss how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can work together to create decolonial history and imagine a future of diverse communities. You can register for this event online as well at our website, which I will share in the link in the chat at the end. We also have another upcoming program, a genealogy workshop called Ethical Dilemmas in Genealogy with Dr. Penny Walters, who will be joining us from the United Kingdom on Sunday, February 21st from 2 to 4 p.m. This session will discuss what ethics and morality mean in terms of genealogy. Ethical dilemmas in genealogy came to the forefront after law enforcement utilized information from GEDmatch to apprehend a suspected serial killer. And it goes ahead and discusses ethical dilemmas that come up in genealogy. Okay. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library, so we'll go ahead and share an online event feedback form in the chat. If you fill it out, you'll not only be helping the library, you'll also be entered to win a library book bag. The only stipulation is the bag must be picked up in person at our library in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So this is just for local residents. Now, let me introduce our presenter for this evening's talk. Charlie Jennison has been active in the Seacoast area music scene since 1964, when his father retired from the Navy and moved back to the family farm in Lee, New Hampshire, where Charlie now resides with his wife, Anne. A graduate of UNH and Lesley College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Charlie has played keyboards, flute, clarinet, and saxophones on over 25 recordings and in dozens of New England groups over the course of his career of 50 years. He is currently lead alto with the Seacoast Big Band, for which he writes and arranges. An associate of local piano legend Tommy Gallant and former UNH Director of Jazz Studies Dave Sealer, Charlie has participated in innumerable jazz jam sessions and concerts at local venues, notably the Press Room and Music Hall in Portsmouth and Johnson Theatre at UNH. Now Vice President of the Seacoast Jazz Society, Charlie currently teaches in the music department at Phillip's Exeter Academy and plays with the faculty jazz group as well as his own quartet, Iridescence. Okay, Charlie.
Thanks, Paulina, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the staff of the Portsmouth Library, Nicole, and the Seacoast Jazz Society for making tonight's presentation possible. We'll leave some time for question and answers afterwards. And I'm going to pull up some slides for us to take a look at tonight. So let me go ahead and share the screen. Excuse me. We'll get them up here where we can see them. Several years ago, the Seacoast Jazz Society asked me to deliver a lecture about influences on my musical development as an artist. Since I've been playing jazz in the Seacoast since 1966, I had enough additional material that I decided to split this presentation into two parts. And tonight, I'm basically going to cover roughly from 1950 to 1985. And in April, I'll discuss 1985 to the present. There's no possible way in this short time to include mention of all the players and venues. So if you don't hear a name you were expecting, ask me about them when we get to the questions and answers. I'd like very much to acknowledge the folks who willingly gave of their time to share some of their recollections with me for this project. Their names are listed on this slide. If I've omitted anyone who's in attendance tonight, I apologize for the oversight. And our background piano's a little bit of Tommy Gallant from an album he recorded in 1983 called By Myself. Right now, it probably goes without saying that the jazz scene in Portsmouth is kind of in hibernation, with the exception of a few small online clusters and solo artists. Protocols have kind of restricted the size of gatherings and crippled the performing arts, because without an audience and the ability to form an ensemble, there's not a lot of live music. But I want to demonstrate tonight that the roots of jazz in this community go deep, and that when more favorable conditions exist in the future, it will once again flourish in the Seacoast. I'm going to begin by quoting from an article by Richard Waltress. It was written in 1984 for New Hampshire Profiles magazine. In it, he asked, "Why does New Hampshire, with the smallest ocean frontage in the country, have a Seacoast big band? Why is Portsmouth, with a population at the time of around 27,000, called the jazz mecca of New England? Where do all the musicians and fans come from?" In answer to his own question, Waltress opines, quote, "Since the heyday of the big bands in the 1930s and 40s, jazz has never really left the Seacoast area. Back then, the Hampton Beach Casino featured all-white suite bands, such as Guy Lombardo and Dorsey Brothers bands. A short distance south at Salisbury Beach in Massachusetts, the liquor laws and the general attitudes were looser, so we had more aggressive black and integrated bands filling the Frolics ballrooms with dancers. Louis Armstrong, Errol Garner, Ella Fitzgerald, and a host of other jazz musicians played inspirational sets. With the advent of the 1950s, the economics of supporting a big band had become overwhelming. Pop singers and rock and roll captured the public's fancy as the big bands quietly disintegrated into their individual components. Small combos played more intimate jazz in clubs and lounges as the giant ballrooms joined other relics of the past. In time, many of these same musicians settled near their old stomping grounds, getting day jobs and occasionally playing at night. For several reasons, Portsmouth provided an attractive haven for these musicians. First, there's the city's inherent beauty with its weathered brick buildings and winding historical districts. The location is ideal, a few minutes from the beach resorts, yet only an hour from both Boston and Portland. These cities, along with Portsmouth and Durham, provided a convenient circuit for the resident performers. So here are some downtown shots of Portsmouth right around the time Eddie Madden, Paul Barrett, Phil Wilson, Les Harris Sr., and Ike Roberts were playing at Salisbury and Hampton Beaches. I arrived in this area in 1965, and I was fortunate to meet some of the musicians and members of the jazz community who were already gigging in local clubs and establishments, and who helped me learn about the music scene at that time. Some of my earliest memories of Seacoast jazz include playing sessions at the Market Square Pub, now Rudy's, hanging out at a piano bar in the old Kearsarge Hotel with a walk-up entrance from Congress Street next to Weinbaum's news shop, and jamming at Sunday brunches at the Dune Lawn Hotel, pictured here, and the Ashworth Hotel in Hampton. While I was at UNH, there were also gigs and sessions in Dover at the Spartan Hotel on the Sherwood Music Lodge. And one summer I played at the La Chalet-sur-le-Mer in York Beach. I recall seeing some big bands at the Rockingham Ballroom. And while we're talking about Newmarket, of course, we want to include the Stone Church. The church has had a rather eclectic past. It was built in 1832 and first served as a Universalist meeting house and also for Unitarian. Catholics bought the church in 1865 and retained ownership until approximately the turn of the 20th century when they sold it. The church then acted alternately as a VFW hall, a roller skating rink, and a shoe assembly plant. The Newmarket Heel Company, which suffered a fire in 1968. So in 1970, a couple of former New Hampshire students, Rod Philbrick and John Williamson, purchased the burnt-out church and turned it into a venue for live music. From then on, it served as a home for local musicians and touring acts. I first saw veteran Newburyport saxophonist Ike Roberts at the church soon after it opened, and was impressed that someone of his advanced age could play with so much energy and fire. In its early days, under renovation, the church had dirt floors and canvas hanging from the ceilings and rafters. Patrons would come out and hang out after a busy day, still dressed in their overalls and work boots, and the atmosphere was rowdy and lively. It was not exactly the easiest audience to play for, although if you won them over, they'd be loudly appreciative. I'm going to continue my narrative by talking about the contributions of some of the people behind the scenes, both by helping others to become aware of the music and by creating some of it themselves. We'll reminisce a little about the 1950s to help set the stage. Then I'll introduce some of the Seacoast musicians who have lived and played in the area for decades and have been most influential in the history of jazz in Portsmouth and surrounding areas. We'll also mention some of the other venues and restaurant owners who supported jazz. The Seacoast jazz scene extends from Newburyport, Mass. To Portland, Maine, with Portsmouth more or less acting as the hub of musical activity. It makes sense that local jazz would be influenced by Boston to the south and Portland to the north. I'll make an effort to tie in some of the significant people from those areas. But to get started, let's meet Warren Muchmore. Here's a recent picture of 3 Seacoast music educators. Russ Grazier, in the middle, is the founder of Portsmouth Music and Arts School, which has been very active since 2002 and successfully motivating and inspiring thousands of Seacoast music and art students of all ages. Their jazz education program has had a wide-ranging influence on jazz appreciation and performance. More about Russ later. Warren Muchmore on the right was one of Russ's high school music teachers, whose knowledge, passion, and guidance inspired Russ to open the Portsmouth Music and Arts Center. Although Warren's been retired for some time, Wendell Purinton on the left is still active as a vocal conductor and teacher. I personally was a benefactor of Warren Muchmore's mentorship, as he encouraged my early big band arranging efforts and both guided my student teaching at Portsmouth High School and my activity in the Portsmouth Musicians Union Big Band, which ended in the 1970s when the union was absorbed into the Boston Local. Warren introduced me to accordionist and conductor Stan Bednarz from Hampton, who conducted concerts at the Hampton Show during the summer of 1968. Many Portsmouth musicians I'll mention tonight studied with Warren or played under his and Bill Elbow's musical direction at Portsmouth High School. And of course, during the decades leading up to the millennium, Warren himself was arranging for and conducting various jazz ensembles around the Seacoast, in addition to rehearsing his award-winning marching band program at Portsmouth High. It's worth mentioning that many music educators in the 1950s and 60s had been veterans of traveling big bands in the swing era, and the nascent profession of jazz education was just starting to develop in high schools and universities around the country and here in New England. Another early contact of mine who was active in the 50s was Ray Nichols Phillip, with whom I played some of my first club dance gigs out at Ladd's Pioneer Lounge on 1A. A home-based piano and voice teacher, Ray had a jazz trio with bassist Jim Olivier and drummer Joe Carrier. Sometimes she'd hire me to front her group on the weekend. Excuse me. Besides Ladd's, some of the other venues at which she appeared were the Farragut Hotel in Rye Beach and the Sherwood Motor Hotel off the Spalding Turnpike in Dover, now known as the Garrison Hotel and Suites. My point here is that teachers can make a lasting impression on young students. And when they combine artistic sensibility and a love of music with a caring attitude and some motivational psychology, it can have a positive effect that lasts a lifetime. Both Warren and Ray influenced many young musicians and themselves contributed to the evolving jazz conversation that was taking place in Portsmouth in the late 1960s. No history of jazz in Seacoast, New Hampshire would be complete without mention of teacher and pianist Paul Barrett. One of the first people I met at UNH and my piano instructor for several years. Barrett received his Bachelor of Arts from UNH in 1952 and his Master of Arts from Boston University. After a term of military service, he came to UNH as a part-time instructor and became a full faculty member in 1965. That's the first year I attended. Paul performed with big bands and jazz combos throughout the 1950s, including Ted Herbert's band from the Manchester area, and was as conversant in the jazz world as he was in academia and the classics. In addition to his teaching duties, Paul was also a practicing professional musician for over 60 years, playing gigs right up to the time of his passing in 2007. For more than a decade, he played at the Metro restaurant in Portsmouth, along with his friend, the late Jim Howe, on bass, and regularly with faculty jazz groups at UNH. Barrett was central to bringing the traditional jazz series to UNH, working closely with Dorothy Prescott, its benefactor. And on that subject, I'll go into more detail a bit later. Although I did not meet trombonist and arranger Eddie Madden until he played with the Seacoast Band in 1978, when Dizzy Gillespie was our guest artist, I later learned that he and UNH classmate Paul Barrett had an extensive musical history together. Excuse me. And I'd like to read some brief excerpts from an email that Eddie sent me in 2009, reminiscing about the gigs he and Paul did in the 1950s. Quote, "Hello, Charlie. I was away in San Francisco when your email came, so forgive me for being a bit late with an answer. This may meander as I recall names, etc. First, Paul Barrett and I played a lot together in various venues, including the Jazz Joints at Salisbury Beach during the 1950s. Most of our jazz playing during the summer months was at the various clubs on the beach, including Shannon's and the Oasis. Although Eddie doesn't mention Ike Roberts from Newburyport, he and tenor saxophonist Walt Jackson were also gigging at Salisbury around the same time." Eddie says, "I do remember playing with Les Harris Sr. and Paul Barrett back then at Edwards Club, as they had a steady job there the summer of 1956. Ray Lacuta, a good jazz tenor player from Rochester, New Hampshire, also frequented those Salisbury Beach sessions. And another fine tenor player I remember was Johnny Bassist from Newburyport. There was an all-female jazz group led by a great trumpet player named Flo Dyer that played one summer at Jenny's Club, and she ran Sunday afternoon jam sessions, which were always well attended." Eddie continues, "Paul and I, along with the young Phil Wilson, were mainstays of those sessions, and Phil and I were always battling it out, swapping choruses. Another superb musician with me during those UNH years was Buzz Emerson, an excellent jazz drummer who later played tenor sax. He just passed on, but before doing so, made a fine career for himself in Connecticut as conductor of the New Haven Symphony. I also recall Dan Carroll, a pianist who could nearly rival Paul Barrett's jazz playing. At UNH, we occasionally held special jazz concerts in New Hampshire Hall, and along with us was our insurance agent for Manchester, Ted Goddard, on tenor and baritone sax. Ted was a great player, and he'd worked with the Claude Thornhill Band and others before getting off the road. Of course, there was music at Hampton Beach, both on the outside bandstand and at the Casino Ballroom. The summer of 1957 and 58, I had a 12-piece band on the outdoor bandstand playing 4 concerts a day throughout the summer. We played everything from marches to show medleys and some jazz as well. Paul Barrett was on the band and a fine jazz tenor player, Tony Sakalaris, who had played the jazz clubs in and around the Seacoast area before I hired him. So that concludes the notes from Eddie Madden and some of the discussion of musical activities around the Seacoast in the 1950s. At this point, I'm going to return to my personal music history timeline and talk about some more of the local musicians who made an impact on my career and development. Although I had been a member of both a Dixieland combo and a stage band, and was fortunate enough to attend Jazz All-State as a high school junior in Florida, I didn't start out playing a lot of jazz when I first arrived in New Hampshire. The summer before my senior year at Oyster River High School, I decided to attend the UNH Summer Youth Music School program. There I met some of the teachers and young New Hampshire-based musicians I'd later worked with in various capacities. The Summer Youth Music School has continued to educate and inspire hundreds of musically oriented youth throughout its existence, and the jazz bands have contributed to the popularity of the art form in the Seacoast since the 1960s. Let's see, get to the next slide. Here we go. Some of my Sims friends were Greg Hackney, a Nashua School of Music teacher, Mark Herbert, son of Ted, saxophonist and band leader, Dick Maynard, saxophonist and award-winning vocal conductor, and Richard Gardenia, who's a composer, arranger, and a woodwind doubler. Richard's been one of the frequent visitors to Portsmouth over the years, playing at one time or another in most of the local clubs. He was also a founding member of the Seacoast Big Band in the late 70s. During that summer at UNH, Paul Barrett introduced me to one of his former students, an introspective, quirky little guy named Robbie Hope, who had just graduated from UNH, but was practicing at the music department that summer. After a brief conversation, Robbie encouraged me to look him up when my classes got underway in the fall of 1965. Through my extracurricular association with him during my years at UNH and for several years after, I played a lot of gigs and concerts. I learned many tunes. I listened to Coltrane and Miles for hours on end, and I absorbed piano voicings, comping styles, and harmonic formula from watching this genius at work. His influence definitely sparked my interest in jazz piano. The individuals pictured here are, from left to right, Robbie, Ed Corey, who played guitar and electric bass, me, at the top of the picture, Don Land, our percussionist, and Dick Willis, our drummer. Not pictured are bassists Wesley Sayer and Dick Biscuinet. This group won first place at the MIT Jazz Festival in 1968, several years before there was an established jazz program at UNH. Those who knew him would probably agree that Robbie was reclusive most of his life, not generally willing to engage in the self-promotion necessary to make a living as a performing musician. And although he played gigs in most of the hotels and clubs that featured jazz, his reputation as a monster was largely among those musicians who were willing to book the gigs or provide transportation. One such musician was saxophonist John Malesi, a UNH grad who for many years assisted Robbie not only in a musical capacity, but with personal support well beyond the call of duty. John and Robbie worked the Seacoast from Boston to Portland during the decades of the 70s through the 90s, playing at the Sheraton Commander in Cambridge, Riverworks Tavern in Nashua, and Colony Hotel in Kennebuck, among others. John's made a living teaching privately and repairing instruments for school music programs, and is still active in his 70s as a jazz tenor sax player, appearing at Jonathan's in Ogunquit with Newburyport guitarist Steve Carter during the summer months. There are several recordings, some still available, of the Malesi Hope duo that contain evidence of Robbie's unique energy and musical vision. One is a self-produced effort called Spirit Talk, which can still be found in some jazz cutout bins if you're lucky. There's also another album entitled Serengeti, but I wasn't able to obtain any more information at the time of this writing. So here's a 1990 CD re-release of Tsunami, featuring Boston bassist John Lockwood and New York drummer Al Foster, in addition to John Malesi and Robbie Hope. Here's a short cut for you. There's a very short cut. Let's see if we can get the to respond. Well, it doesn't look like it's going to. Okay, first glitch. We'll move on. We'll come back if we can get the sound clips working later. Okay, here's Barbara London, another close musician friend of Robbie's, was composer, flutist, pianist, vocalist Barbara London. Barbara worked in the 1970s with Robbie at a long since closed local venue known as Flagstone's Restaurant in Newington. Also Joseph's Rye and the Rocks. They had a concert group together called Children of the Morning. Barbara currently resides in Hampton. She's a multi-instrumentalist, a watercolor artist, music educator, and a writer. Her long career in the arts has involved leading her own groups, composing for jazz and classical ensembles, producing recordings for her own record label, and exhibiting her artwork in solo and group shows. She taught at the University of Maine, Augusta, and Berklee College of Music in Boston, where she was the chairperson of the Harmony Department for 10 years. Barbara and I collaborated in the early 1970s on several different projects, including jazz workshops and concerts in the public schools, funded by the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts. She received 3 National Endowment for the Art grants for her jazz performances as flutist, vocalist, and pianist. We also played at other universities and on various recording sessions, and continued our musical endeavors into 1988 when we recorded a jazz album of original compositions with John Hunter on bass and Bill Reeve, marching band director at UNH, on drums. And that album was called Flat Out Dreaming. Speaking of John Hunter, Barbara introduced me to John, who moved to the Seacoast from Sydney, Maine, while obtaining his engineering degree at UNH. He originally played electric bass, but gradually switched over to acoustic as he became more invested in playing jazz. John and I have worked together for several decades, playing duo gigs in local clubs and restaurants. Later, as members of the Faculty Jazz Quintet at UNH, we finally formed our own quartet, Iridescence, and recorded our first CD in 1996. Since then, we've continued our musical conversation whenever possible. John's performed in concerts and TV appearances from Maine to San Francisco with an impressive list of nationally recognized jazz greats. It would take me the rest of the hour to tell you all the folks he's worked with. He's toured and recorded for many years with the Shaw Brothers, and he's presently a member of the Seacoast Big Band and the Capitol Jazz Orchestra, which toured the Eastern United States with clarinetist Ken Poplawski in the fall of 2013. His teaching credits include faculty positions since 1979 at the University of New Hampshire, Dartmouth College, University of Maine and Augusta, New Hampshire Summer Youth Music School, and numerous clinics and workshops at colleges and public schools throughout the Northeast. In addition to my teaching and playing saxophone in the 1970s, I was investigating the cocktail piano circuit along the Maine coast up as far as Kennebunk. Several summers, I was able to find employment in York and Ogunquit at places like the Ocean House, York Harbor Inn, Cape Nettic Inn, Jonathan's, Compass Rose, and the Hurricane in Perkins Cove. One musician who assisted me in finding work was bassist Dick Biscuinet, who until recently was playing at the Oak Street Bistro in Alfred, Maine. Excuse me. While a student at UNH, I also met Durham resident Paul Heckel, whose father taught at the university. We struck up a musical friendship that has lasted to the current day, and we plan to start playing again as soon as it's safe to do so. We're currently investigating some new technology to allow us to play some duets over a fast internet connection. Paul's been an active freelance vibraphonist in the New England jazz scene for over 30 years. He's had the opportunity to play with many world-renowned jazz artists, including Dizzy Gillespie, Clark Terry, Joe Williams, and Buddy DeFranco. He also plays with many well-known regional players such as Nate Terrian and Tim Webb. He's got a wide-ranging repertoire of jazz standards and other tunes, and often plays duos with John Hunter on bass, where the improvised musical interactions resemble conversations among friends. Another exciting jazz pianist attending graduate school at the university in the late 1960s was Mike Marcoverich, who used to run a weekly jam session at the Tin Palace in Durham, a local college watering hole at the time. We all recall fondly the weeknight sessions with Paul on drums or vibes, Mike on piano, John on bass, and various UNH horn players, including John Malesi, Barbara London, myself, and John Bethel, at the time also a graduate student at UNH. In various combinations, this pool of players participated in local jams, gigs, and concerts at churches and other social venues in the Seacoast area. Originally from Nashua, Mike played in southern New Hampshire for a while after graduation, then moved to Massachusetts, took up residence in Hyannis, where for many years he played at the Harbor Inn and hosted jam sessions at Bobby Burns Jazz Club, which is where I first had the opportunity to meet Marshall Wood, Donna Byrne, Lou Colombo, and George Garzone. Speaking of John Bethel, here he is pictured with bassist Dick Biscuinet. John received his master's in music education from UNH in 1969 and later became director of bands at Exeter Junior High School. Born in Bermuda, he enlisted in the Army as a woodwind specialist in the 1st Army Band, Anchorage, Alaska. After his discharge, he attended Brooklyn College, where he studied classical clarinet before moving to New Hampshire. For over 30 years, he developed and directed the popular band program at Exeter and inspired students in areas of music theory and appreciation. During his career, he played professional saxophone, clarinet, and flute in many jazz bands and classical ensembles around New England and New York until his passing in March of 2019. One of the most influential musicians in the development and growth of Seacoast jazz is this gentleman, whose family was originally from Exeter. Tommy Gallant was an integral part of many jazz groups, workshops, concerts, and the regional music education scene for over 40 years. Sometime in 1967, I met Tommy, who'd also been active in the Seacoast area since the late 1950s. He invited me to stop by the library restaurant in the Rockingham Hotel and bring my saxophone. Many local musicians would sit in with Tommy and his longtime friend Smiley Trefethen on bass. Those library sessions were always well attended. More about Smiley in a minute. Tommy served in the U.S. Marines before beginning a long career as a jazz musician, promoter, and educator. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of jazz and standard tunes, which he could quickly transpose into any key, as well as a rich improvisational vocabulary steeped in the blues. One of his teachers at Berkeley, Nat Pierce, arranged for and played with the Woody Herman Band, and at one point asked Tommy to sub on Woody's band for him for a few weeks. Tommy's longtime Exeter friend, whose father was a math teacher at Phillip's Exeter Academy, was trombonist Phil Wilson, also an alum of the Herman Herd. Later, when Tommy was teaching at the Academy, Phil would be a frequent guest on the jazz concerts. Let's see if this, this one might respond. Let's check this one out. Nope, doesn't look like our sound system's going to work tonight. So we'll have to do the sound. Oh, there it goes. So that's a small sampling of Tommy's Rosetta. Here's a picture of us jamming on the Viking Queen, probably 1975. Tommy was committed to helping promote jazz in the local area. And in addition to organizing the annual Harry Jones Memorial Scholarship Concert, held each year at the Music Hall in Portsmouth, he could often be found performing and giving clinics on the art of jazz at local schools. He ran jazz workshops at UNH, and his groups played in the traditional jazz series there. He was a driving force behind the Portsmouth Summer Jazz Festival, and after his death in 1998, it was decided that the festival should be named for him in honor of his lifelong service to the community as musician and educator. I'll always be grateful to Tommy for his friendship and guidance. He not only introduced me in 1975 to Doan and a host of wonderful Maine jazz musicians, but also assisted me in obtaining the teaching position in 1990 at Phillip's Exeter, which I still hold. His stepson from his second marriage, Ricky Shepard, now lives in Kittery, took his first saxophone lessons with me, and Rick went through the jazz program at UNH and later became a professional bassoonist and woodwind repair expert. All right, let's see. I'm not sure if this is jumping around or not. Here, hang on a second. Here we go. All right. Okay, let's see. Tommy's influence on the music scene for over 40 years can't be overstated. He was one of the early members of the Seacoast Jazz Society, and he helped organize many concerts, sessions, and workshops over the years, including being involved with the series at Prescott Park. He also fronted a jam session at the Press Room for several decades, and his connection with the university and the traditional jazz series paved the way for many nationally and internationally recognized artists to visit the area and play with the house rhythm section, which consisted first of Tommy on piano, Jim Howe on bass, and Les Harris Sr. on drums, with Les Harris Jr. eventually taking his father's place. Jim Howe is best remembered for his presence in the Tommy Gallant Trio, of which he was an original member group, on Sunday nights at the press room for a sideman for some 20 years, and then when Tommy was gone, as leader of the Jim Howe Trio for another 9 years. Jim grew up in Old Town, Maine, where he began playing the upright bass in the 6th grade. After graduating high school in 1964, he went to the University of Maine in Orono, where he continued his studies, establishing a reputation for his musicianship and performing with the Bangor Symphony. Jazz, of course, was Jim's first love, and so once out of college, he moved to Boston, where he soon became an active player on that city's jazz scene. After a few years, he came back north, played at the Mount Washington Hotel, and not long after that, he took on a new role teaching band and music classes at Parkside Junior High in Manchester, which is about the time I first met him. It was some years after that that Jim made his move to the Seacoast, establishing himself in Portsmouth and playing regularly at the press room and 2 nights a week at the Metro, where he teamed up with pianists Paul Barrett one night and Paul Donovan the other. He also established himself in yet another career as a professional photographer. The Jim Howe Photography Studio was a fixture on State Street for many years. In 2000, after an illness, Jim gave up his Portsmouth residence and moved 2 hours away to his cabin in Hanover, Maine. He commuted regularly from there to the press room, the Metro, and to the Academy, where he was an adjunct instructor. The Seacoast jazz community was shocked on October 13th, 2007, when Jim died at the age of 61. At that time, the drummer and longtime bandmate of Jim, Les Harris Jr., said, quote, "First and foremost, Jim was a great guy. Everyone who knew him loved him. He was a real loyal friend, a give you the shirt off his back kind of guy." The musical impact of the press room trio was attributable in part to the tremendous musicianship of these two individuals, who I am very fortunate to have known well and played many gigs with over the years. Les Sr. could have toured nationally, but chose to raise a family in Newburyport, working as an insurance broker. Later, he taught at Berkeley for many years. He worked with Toshiko Akiyoshi and Charlie Mariano, and he was active in the Newburyport Jazz Society, organizing many concerts where he invited luminaries such as Tyree Glenn, Teddy Wilson, Maxine Sullivan, Jimmy Rushing, and Bobby Hackett to perform locally. Les was the original member of the Press Room Trio before relinquishing the drum set to Les Jr. sometime in the early 1990s, when Jr. came off the road from international tours with the vocal jazz group The Ritz. Les Jr. has maintained a dual career as a teacher at UNH, University of Southern Maine, Phillips Exeter Academy, and Newburyport Middle School, while playing several nights a week locally or in Boston. His association with UNH led to concerts with many nationally recognized players, and with his vocal talents, he's also been a significant contributor to the Ritz and several Beatles revival groups. Les's daughter Aubrey is an up-and-coming vocalist, songwriter, and bass player who currently lives in LA, but attends local sessions when visiting home. Another musical family that had a significant influence on the Seacoast jazz scene were the three Trefethen brothers, Smiley, Dave, and Jim. Smiley, the oldest, was Tommy Gallant's bass player of choice, and the two of them used to play all over Portsmouth, including several nights a week on the Viking Queen dinner cruise to the Isles of Shoals. Legend has it that Smiley used to store his upright bass in the dock warehouse between boat gigs, and that one night after the Viking Queen had set sail for the Shoals, Smiley uncovered his bass only to discover that someone had bashed in the front of the instrument with a blunt object. It was too late to turn back, so Tommy had to do the heavy lifting and play solo that night for the dancers. Soon after, Smiley appeared on the gig with a new upright bass, constructed of aluminum. It honestly didn't sound all that great, but at least it was impervious to damage. In my estimation, Dave, the next oldest brother, was the most talented of the three, being not only an accomplished guitar and upright bass player, but also a licensed pilot. Once when I was visiting Dave at home, he showed me a miniature airplane he was constructing in his garage. I don't know if he ever got it to fly, but I was certainly impressed with his engineering skills. Dave tastefully accompanied many Seacoast area artists for decades, notably Paul Broadnax and of course Tommy Gallant, and eventually moved to New York State about a decade ago when he retired from his gig with the phone company. Smiley and Dave's youngest brother Jim, not pictured here, played alto sax quite well in the style of Paul Disman, and used to frequent many of the Portsmouth sessions in the 80s and 90s at the Warehouse, Press Room, and Horse of a Different Color, also making appearances in venues along the Maine coast. I first met Tommy Barron while hanging out at the Library restaurant in the old Rockingham Hotel in the 1960s. Self-effacing but melodically astute, he and I would jam with Tommy, Gallant, and Smiley Trefethen on standard tunes, and once in a while Phil Wilson would make a guest appearance, which upped the ante considerably. I should mention Tommy's a trumpet player. Vocalist Pauline Vincent was sometimes waiting on tables at the library and would willingly take a break to sing with the group. Over the years, Tommy and I would collaborate at other venues, including the Press Room, Joseph's Rye and the Rocks, Lucas Greenhouse Restaurant in Northampton. He recalls jamming with members of the Jones family at their home on Woodbury Avenue in the late 50s, which was corroborated by Sharon in a recent conversation. Other participants at those sessions included Sharon's sister Jean and her piano-playing husband Paul Earle, Walt Jackson and Ike Roberts on tenor and alto saxes, and a young Dave Trefethen on bass or guitar. Often they'd be accompanied by drummer Benny Brown, who had, according to Tommy, a light in his bass drum that lit up every time his foot hit the pedal. As Tommy recounts it, there was also a place called the Fleet Reserve Cafe, perhaps where the old Victory Cafe used to be, and a dive someplace on Daniel Street called the PRA Club, where only the brave or foolhardy would venture to hear music on weekends when sailors were in town. The original Rosa restaurant opened in 1927. Ownership didn't change hands until the 1980s. And when Tommy Barron started sitting in with local groups, the room with the bar next door to the restaurant where the music took place carried the name of the Forest Club. In the 1980s, under new ownership, I remember some great sessions held at Rosa's for a group known as the Turkey Club, which would meet every few months at local establishments like Rosa's and the Exeter Inn for the purpose of seeing old friends, having a jam session now and then, and swapping the latest jokes and stories. This group included both players and fans, and you might see Joe Stelmach, Terry McDonald, Pete Lagasse, Paul Combs, George Blodgett, Renee Byron, Don and Al Doan, Les Harris Sr., and others, sometimes even Phil Wilson or Herb Pomeroy from Boston. Often dinner would precede the jam session, and the meetings continued into the 1990s. Unfortunately, most of the original members of the Turkey Club have now passed on, and the newly renovated Rosa's after 2012 has not featured music as part of its atmosphere. Of course, the Rosa restaurant was also where the Memorial Bridge All-Stars had their humble beginnings. The original members of the group were Bud Carter on cornet, Bob Ingraham banjo, Ted Johnson piano, Peter Stusek trombone, Jack Williams clarinet, Howard Dearborn bass, and Ed Smith on drums. They were later joined by clarinetist Nat Balch. Let's see if we can get a little bit of this soundtrack to work here. I had a delayed reaction from the other one, so I thought maybe this one would come around too, but. So that's a foot tapping group, if I ever heard one. The sketch, by the way, was done by one of the Seacoast's biggest jazz fans, ambidextrous artist Bob Nilsson. Bob was a contributing artist to the Portsmouth Herald since the 1960s. He's been drawing all his life, and he had an enchanted childhood growing up on a boat that I think could only have produced an artist. Bob was a frequent attendee at sessions and concerts and generated many sketches of local and regional artists, some of which he'd give away after the performance. I've got many copies of his sketches in my scrapbook. If someone were to ask me what Portsmouth family made the greatest impact on the jazz scene in Portsmouth over the last 50 years, I'd have to say it was the Jones family. In the 1950s, they lived in the Cutts Mansion on Maplewood, And although all the 10 children of Harry and Ethel Jones were not jazz musicians, most of them were involved in playing or singing music. The informal jam sessions hosted by them in their living room every week informed and inspired their children. And here are a few I was fortunate to get to know. The oldest son, Harry, born in 1930, had a radio program on WBBX in the early 1980s called Before Your Time, on which he played the jazz hits of the 30s and 40s. Harry had a great sense of humor, once introducing bassist Jim Howe by saying, "I'd like you to meet one of the best bass players in the country. Unfortunately, most of the gigs are in the city." Another time, he introduced me by telling the audience I could play so many instruments that if you handed me a cheeseburger, I could get it to play Yankee Doodle. Harry was a man of many talents and interests. He was a graduate of UNH with degrees in microbiology and biochemistry. He worked at the Jonas Salk Institute in California on the polio vaccine, and he was a tireless supporter of jazz in the community. Although he passed away in 1990 at the age of 60, his love and enthusiasm for jazz is still recognized by an annual memorial jazz concert every February, now at UNH's Johnson Theater, and generally featuring the Seacoast Band. Harry's younger brother, Tom, graduated from Portsmouth High School in 1955, and upon his return from the Army after the Korean conflict, began developing a musical career as a vocalist and bass player. He spent some time in Atlanta before coming home to Portsmouth, and his resume included gigs with tenor saxophonist Eleanor Jacquet and singer Esther Phillips. I have a recollection of playing gigs with Tom, drummer George Hale, and pianist Roger Jakes in the Market Square pub in the late 1960s, and also working with Tom at the Library Restaurant with Tommy Gallant when Smiley had another engagement. He remained active on the music scene until his passing in 2001. Tom's younger sister, Sharon, sings and plays the drums, and for decades has been very popular in Seacoast clubs and restaurants, always drawing full houses when she sings jazz and blues at the press room. She started working around the area in the late 1950s and only recently cut back on her busy performing schedule. I've had the honor and privilege of playing many gigs and recording a CD with her since we met sometime in the 80s. Her versatility frequently found her performing in many different styles, and sporting the nickname Brown Sugar, she fronted two bands, including Brown Sugar and Company and State Street Rhythm and Blues, until around 2010. Her connection with audiences is immediate because her life experience commands their attention, and they can relate to the sincerity in her delivery. Although she's semi-retired, Sharon still makes an occasional appearance for a concert or other jazz-related event. Several of her CDs are still available at Bull Moose Records on Congress Street. A Newburyport resident and close friends with the Harris family, Annie held court for several years at the Riversmere restaurant on Bow Street, either as a solo pianist with vocals or as a duo with Jim Howe on bass. Les Jr. also sat in on those gigs, as did Annie's son Darrell, also a talented pianist and vocalist. Darrell and Les were two of the founders of the jazz vocal group The Ritz, who we'll talk more about later. John Light served time in the Air Force and managed the Officers Club on Pease when the Strategic Air Command was there. Later, the club became Patty's Restaurant on the renovated airbase and would feature jazz groups on weekends and for various functions. Besides hiring local bands to play at the club, John would show up at sessions around the area and entertain us with his trumpet playing and jazz vocals. His companion, Darby Tench, also provided operatic versions of jazz standards. Here, John appears with Sharon Jones on vocals and Jim Butka, a UNH graduate, on piano. They frequently performed at the Central Wave, formerly the Spartan Hotel, on Central Avenue in Dover. Now that I've introduced some of the main players in the evolution and history of jazz, I'd like to quote from photographer J.D. Lincoln in his book, People of Portsmouth and Some Who Came to Town. On page 32, he says, "In the 1970s, both tourists and the locals patronized the theater. Then came the restaurants, then came music. The population of musicians multiplied to the extent that, by the end of the decade, music permeated Portsmouth daily and nightly, 7 days a week." End of quote. Moving into the 1970s, the pace of activity picked up considerably in the Seacoast as local musicians and UNH graduates began forming various groups and frequenting local clubs, supplemented by other musical immigrants such as Larry Garland from Newburyport, Massachusetts, T.J. Wheeler from Central Maine, and Mike Weatherly and Janice Russell from Boston. Dances took place at the Masonic Hall, Cape Nettic Lobster Pound, Yokin's Restaurant. Concerts were happening at Portsmouth High School Auditorium, outdoors on summer stages. And in 1973, the university began hosting annual jazz festivals in the Granite State Room on campus. In 1977, the nonprofit Pro Portsmouth began planning the first Market Square Day, which launched in June 1978 to great fanfare. Over several seasons, it provided many local jazz groups the opportunity to develop a wider audience. The press room opened its doors in November 1976, thanks to Jay Smith, journalist, quiet philanthropist, musician, and folk music lover, to provide a place for local musicians to perform and their fans together for, quote, nourishment of the body, mind, and spirit. A few years later, the press room expanded into the second floor of the building in order to accommodate more popular performers and larger audiences. The press room quickly solidified its reputation as one of the most important music venues and gathering spots in the Seacoast. Standing the test of time, decades-old traditions like Hoot Night, Sunday Jazz Series, Friday Traditional Music Open Session, Tuesday Night Jazz Jam, and others remain mainstays of the space. In 1983, notable college radio personality, DJ, and music historian Bruce Pingree took over booking and general management of the venue, holding the reins for more than 2 decades. Bruce is deeply passionate about his community and is a huge supporter of the Seacoast music scene. His musical roots run deep, and he's got an incredible wealth of knowledge to share about many styles of music. Larry moved to Portsmouth from Newburyport in 1977 and went to work at the press room, which had only opened the year before. Jay Smith told Larry, "I want folk and jazz here, no rock and roll." Larry played piano there every Saturday night downstairs for about 35 years. His jam session, currently on Tuesdays, has been running for nearly 12 years. Some of the early players Larry worked with in the 70s and 80s included Marco Salvaggio on trumpet, John Neves on bass, and Jimmy Mosier on alto sax. At the time Larry moved up here, the Horse of a Different Color on Deer Street was winding down under the proprietorship of John Michael Isaac. I recall this building, by the way, is renovated. It's not the original picture, which I'm looking for right now. So if anybody has an original picture of the Horse of a Different Color, let me know. I recall many sessions here with the house rhythm section of Tommy Gallant, Jim Howe, and Les Harris before they took up residence at the press room. One memorable jam had me, Barbara London, Dave Seiler, and Dick Johnson all playing flutes, and we even got Tommy to scat sing. The Horse later became the Tugboat Tavern, where Renee Byron, pianist, and John Light, trumpet player, found a home for their piano-trumpet duo, often accompanied by various bass players. And at some point, there were sessions at the Sheraton across the street, but I believe those might have been in the 1990s. Larry Garland remembers a big band under the direction of a guitar player whose last name was Jacobs, Sundays at the Southwind in Northampton. The Southwind also had an organist named Norman Main, who performed weekends with Patty, a vocalist. Tommy Gallant frequently would appear Sundays with Boston musicians coming up for the afternoon, as would Doan and his Portland-based Little Big Band, of which I was a member for about 5 years. Larry Garland and I also did sessions at the Cape Nettic Inn with bassist John Neves from Boston. Other groups popular in the Seacoast area in the 1970s included Ben Baldwin and the Big Note, T.J. Wheeler and the Ragtime Millionaires, who opened at the Stone Church in 1975, the Memorial Bridge All-Stars, previously mentioned, and Ray DeMarco with Street Level Swing at Rose's Restaurant. The Big Note featured Ben on vocals and alto and Barry saxes, accompanied by Kent Allen on guitar and keyboards, Mike Weatherly on bass, Ray Herman on drums. I also filled in on keyboards and saxes for gigs that required expanded instrumentation. We worked up some 4-part vocal arrangements and recorded a demo album, but forces within the group were moving to break away from rhythm and blues in the Louis Jordan swing format. Later in the decade, Ben hired John Ross on bass, Chuck Chaplin on piano, and Ray Brunel on drums, and would use various tenor sax soloists imported from Boston and New York. And here's an early cut. This is early big note at the Dolphin Striker, I believe.
Savo, the home of sweet romance. Savo, it wins you at a glance. Savo, gives happy feet a chance to dance. Your form just like a clinging vine. Your lips so warm and sweet as wine. Your cheeks so soft and close to mine. Divine. How my heart is a-singing when the band is swinging. I'm never tired of romping and stomping with you at the Savoy, a perfect holiday. Savoy, where we can glide and sway. Savoy, we'll dance the night away, a divine.
Okay, looks like we got 2 slides in here. All right, here we go. Here's the Dolphin Striker, where that cut was recorded, by the way. The Striker was a popular venue that started up around this time, and it was hosted by Peter Rice. It was a classy restaurant upstairs, and it featured folk and jazz music several nights a week, with larger groups squeezed into the Spring Hill Tavern Lounge downstairs along the back wall on the weekends. The York Harbor Inn was also following this same model, providing young jazz groups with a robust audience for their music. Mike Weatherly came up to audition with Ben early summer of 1977, which is when I met him. He commuted from Boston primarily to work with the band at the Cape Netick Lobster Pound. Since the pound was located on a tidal inlet, if you parked your car in the wrong spot, you were likely to find it underwater after an evening of dancing. Mike's wife, Janice, who's a terrific jazz vocalist, would sit in, bring the house down. Eventually, Mike and Janice rented an apartment on Penhallow Street, and she started singing at the Dolphin Striker with Al McIntosh on piano. Mike left the big note, and the next summer, I worked with him and Janice both at the Striker and on Exchange Street in Portland at various clubs. They moved back to New York City in 1979 when Mike got an offer for full-time work repairing upright basses. They were only here for a short time, couple of years, but they made a big impact on the jazz scene and personally on my development as a jazz pianist. Peter Jarvis passed away in February of 2017 at the age of 86. Sam and his family opened the popular Metro restaurant on High Street in the mid-1970s and operated it until 2006. Many Seacoast area jazz musicians gathered around the grand piano in the lounge area for over 30 years for gigs and sessions, including Tommy Gallant, Paul Barrett, Jim Howe, Les Harris, and numerous others. Jarvis was also a mentor to restaurateur Keith Barringer, and he was chosen to open Rudy's restaurant in the former Metro space, keeping much of the legacy of hospitality and some of the traditions, including jazz, intact. Thinking of the Metro reminded me to include 2 important figures on the scene since the mid-70s, both drummers. Terry McDonald, with a background in publishing, served as editor of the Seacoast Jazz newsletter for many years, in addition to being a patron of the arts and frequent participant in jam sessions at the Press Room and Roses, and a member of various groups like Dry Martini since the 1970s. Pete Lagasse, unfortunately no longer with us, played at the Metro with Paul Donovan, there pictured on piano in the background. And like Terry, was a staunch supporter of Seacoast Jazz and attended many sessions at places like the Studio Restaurant in Northampton, the Library Restaurant, and Luca's Greenhouse in Hampton. I'd be remiss in not including mention of Newburyport's visual artist and jazz drummer, Peter Bodge, who worked with pianist Paul Broadnax, among others. Peter's marvelous linoleum etchings of Duke Ellington, Monk, and other famous musicians hang in various Seacoast area galleries. And I'll introduce Paul Broadnax in my second presentation in April. One of the most interesting characters I've met in my career as a jazz musician on the Seacoast is bluesman T.J. Wheeler. T.J. moved to the Seacoast from Waterville, Maine in the 1960s, and he's been here ever since. Early on, T.J. played swing and blues with Pat Hat-Rat Gallagher on harp, then formed a group called the Down East Jazz Babies with trumpet player Dick Cash and the Page brothers, Bob and Dave, on drums and piano, respectively. TJ, whose background is steeped in blues tradition as a result of his self-imposed blues quest, where he actually lived and played with authentic bluesmen in the South, disguises a music educator in the costume of an authentic bluesman with an open kind of down-home persona, hiding the fact he's really on a mission to teach everyone about the importance of blues in their life. He's a creative writer, singer, and a multi-instrumentalist, and he's mostly known for his traditional blues guitar playing style, but he's also got a mean flat pick when he needs it to play some bluegrass or traditional gypsy jazz. He's been a constant presence in the Seacoast, playing at just about every establishment and appearing at many jam sessions on many concerts, while simultaneously providing workshops in schools and supporting charitable causes. One program he organized provided instruments to New Orleans school kids after Hurricane Katrina. He also helped launch an annual blues festival here in Portsmouth. Here's an early recording of TJ with the Smokers.
Miles get cheaper, price gets steeper. Find myself a woman I just couldn't keep her. Time's getting tougher than tough. Things getting rougher than rough. Oh, I make a lot of money. I just keep spending the stuff. Now politicians say, cut down on your meat. Why don't they cut the price and let the people eat? Time's getting tougher than tough. Things getting rougher than rough. Oh, I make a lot of money. I just keep spending the stuff.
I'll play those blues, TJ. As I mentioned earlier, in the late 1960s, there had been a piano bar in the old Kearsarge Hotel around the corner from the Cinema Theater. The late 1970s was a period of renovation in Portsmouth history. I'm going to quote from TJ's journal about one of the most colorful jazz clubs to ever decorate the Portsmouth jazz scene, the Kearsarge House, run by Dr. Bill Stewart and his German girlfriend, always referred to as Miss Honey. Located on the corner of Congress and Chestnut by the Music Hall, the infamous Kearsarge House was home to some of the wildest parties and sessions before or since its opening in the late 1970s. Going through the Congress Street entrance, on the first floor was a bar and a concert club on the right, and on the left a semi-casual restaurant, with the second floor being more of fine dining. The third floor had some rooms for bands and a flop house with musicians sleeping on mattresses on the floor. Bookings included a mix of local acts like Ben Baldwin and the Big Note, Island Side, Blues Prophets, and B.J. Johnson, and some national acts such as the Jeff Muldair Band, Sun Seals, Albert Collins, Jimmy Rogers, Johnny Copeland, Coco Taylor, and Mose Allison Quartet was even here for 5 nights in a row, among others. TJ played there on solo guitar, as well as with the Down East Jazz Babies, which included me whenever possible, and would sit in with many of the blues bands. As TJ recounts, for at least the Jazz Babies, this was how the gig would work: an agreed upon amount of dollars, lodging in the above-mentioned third floor flop house, half price off on food and drinks until the joint cleared out, and it was just Dr. Bill, Miss Honey, some of the bar crew, the band, and a few guests. Then everything was free, including the deli. We'd start jamming with Dr. Bill sitting in on blues harp and usually play till around 4 a.m. The police would sometimes come by, hammering on the door, telling us to stop, which we'd comply with for about 10 minutes, then go right back up again. Around 3 a.m., Dr. Bill often had to leave to go to work as one of the doctors in the emergency room in the Lawrence, Massachusetts hospital. He was a real doctor. The whole run of Dr. Bill's Kearsarge Speakeasy went from roughly 1978 through 1980. He reputedly went bankrupt in early 81 when, due to a deadly cold, intense winter, the vacated building's pipes froze and broke, flooding the first floor. But there's never before or after such a club that combined live music of regional and national acts at least 5 nights a week. In 1975, Tommy introduced me to trombonist Don Doan, an alumni of the Woody Herman and Maynard Ferguson band. He was called the best musician Maine has ever seen, and there are few who would take issue with the claim. Don was born in Portland, took up the trombone when he was in grade school, and majored in music at Boston University. After a stint in the Army, he went off to New York City to become a professional jazz musician. But in the late 1960s, he got tired of life on the road. He missed his wife and family and decided to come home to Maine, where he spent the rest of his career teaching music and playing gigs. Okay, so this is not a Portsmouth venue, but the influence of the Sunday sessions at the Bridgeway in South Portland reverberated up and down the coast from Portland to Boston. With his brother Al on bass, Don organized and directed many different groups, including a 12-piece little big band that played Sunday afternoons at this location for many years, using scaled-down versions of the charts he brought home from Maynard's and Woody's books. I became Don's lead alto player, and for the next 5 years spent a lot of time in Maine, working not only with his bands, but with other small groups as well. Don was part of the Tommy Gallant All-Stars, who appeared frequently in the Seacoast and at the university. Don often visited Seacoast, New Hampshire, playing on dinner cruises from Portsmouth Harbor and appearing at the press room and the summer jazz festivals in Prescott Park, both as soloist and with various ensembles. In the 1990s, his group, the Super Senior Sextet, would play occasional Sundays at the press room. In 2001, his world took a dramatic turn when he suffered a massive stroke and left it paralyzed on the left side. "You'll never play the trombone again," he was told. The doctor who so advised him, however, apparently didn't know about the valve trombone, which doesn't require two hands to play. Don's brother Al mounted a valve trombone on a chair, and soon Don was playing regularly again at the Bridgeway and from time to time at the press room. By learning to play valve trombone, Don added more than a decade to his musical career. He was 84 when he passed away on December 16, 2015. He'll be remembered fondly and with great respect for his musicianship and his passion for playing. In the late 1970s, let's see, I don't know if I can get a soundtrack up on this. Nope, I guess not. Okay. In the late 1970s, I met Ann Sylvester, my wife-to-be, and who at that time was on the staff of Theater by the Sea. And that's when my appreciation of how the theater culture in Portsmouth was influencing the growth of music and arts in the community. And I'll discuss that next time. So at this point, I'm going to take a break from the early days of jazz and see if there's any questions I might be able to answer. When we resume our discussion in April, I'll talk about the far-reaching influence of Dave Seiler, director of jazz studies at UNH for over 40 years, and introduce some of the younger musicians who are determining the direction of jazz in the 21st century. So away we go, and back to, here we go. Good, everybody's still here.
Hello. If anyone has any questions, you should be able to unmute yourself now, and you can feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself and say them out loud.
Hey, Charlie.
Hi, Don.
Don Davis here. Yeah. Thanks, man, for filling in a lot of the gaps. You know, I didn't move up to this area till like the 90s, so I've been hearing about a lot of these people you've been talking about just by name. I've crossed paths with some of them, but it was great seeing those faces and getting a good idea of what was going on. I didn't realize, you've been around for a long time up here.
Yeah. I'm happy to say that most of the folks I'm talking about are friends of mine, and I've played music with them. So that makes this doubly enjoyable.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have crossed paths with you, and I really appreciate you keeping the flame going all these years too.
Well, let's plan some jams in the future here. It isn't over yet.
I hear you. Oh yeah, I know. I got you. For sure. Thanks, though.
You bet. Well, I guess we must have answered most of everybody's questions so far.
I think so. You were very thorough. All right. There are links to give feedback in the chat. And Charlie has been gracious enough to say that if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to email him your questions at charlesjennison@gmail.com.
Actually, it's Charles.Jennison.
Yes, charles.jennison@gmail.com. Thank you.
Yep.
So if we don't have any further questions, everyone can leave, or feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye as you leave. But I think that brings this program to an end. Thank you.